When we think of Germany, a few things come to mind. A country that seems to function perfectly, with incredible and prosperous cities that seem straight out of a dream. However, the reality is not so perfect. There's a side of this story that almost no one talks about, a side that remains very hidden. Because even in one of the richest nations in the world, there are people living in very difficult situations, struggling every day to cover the basics. Today, we are going to explore that hidden side of Germany that doesn't appear in postcards or in the media. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and let's start with this video. When we talk about Germany, it's impossible not to think about the size of its economy. Germany's GDP is one of the largest in the world, and it's no coincidence that the country is known as the economic engine of Europe. Here, industries are incredibly strong. Automobiles, chemicals, machinery, all state-of-the-art and designed for export. To give you an idea, Germany is among the largest exporters on the planet, competing with giants like China and the United States. You surely know at least one of the major German companies, famous worldwide, especially automotive ones like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz. On the surface, money and wealth seem abundant in this country, but this is where a part that few imagine comes in. While these figures are impressive, there's a hidden reality behind all this. More than 15% of the German population lives below the poverty line. That means millions of people are trying to survive on an income that, by the country's standards, barely covers basic expenses. And mind you, this doesn't just affect those who are unemployed. Many people work, sometimes in 2 or 3 jobs, and still can't escape poverty. This phenomenon is called wage inequality. The rich get richer, while a good portion of the population falls behind. And if we analyze who are the most affected, the picture becomes even more striking. Migrants, for example, are one of the most vulnerable groups. Even with degrees, experience, and training, many end up trapped in low-paying jobs, with few opportunities to improve their situation. Another group that also feels the weight of inequality is single mothers. Often, these women are forced to make heartbreaking decisions, like choosing between paying rent or putting food on the table. And then there are the retirees. Though hard to believe, there are elderly people in Germany who need to count every penny because their pensions are not enough to cover the cost of living. It is estimated that 1 in 5 retirees in Germany lives in poverty, even after a lifetime of work. In most cases, they face an extremely difficult reality. But what is it like to be poor in Germany? When you look at these beautiful streets, you don't see poverty as evidently as in other countries. Here, poverty is harder to perceive, more hidden in people's day-to-day lives. Yes, there are places that I will show you later that could be compared to slums. But, in general, it's not so easy to distinguish who is truly poor in Germany. In this country, a person is considered poor if they earn less than 60% of the national average income. What does this mean in practice? Roughly like this, if the average income in Germany is 4,000 euros per month, those earning less than 2,400 euros are classified as poor. Now, hold on. It's not that these people are necessarily going hungry or living on the street, although there are still cases like that. The problem is that with those incomes, they can't maintain the same standard of living as the majority, and that makes a big difference in a country where the cost of living is very high. In Germany, housing is expensive, transportation is expensive, and even grocery shopping can be a challenge depending on where you live. So, although 2,400 euros might seem like a lot in other countries, in Germany it represents a rather tight budget. As I mentioned before, poverty in Germany is not always visible. But there are specific places and situations where you can more clearly observe how complicated it can be to survive here. One of these places is the Brennpunkte. This term can be translated as hotspots or conflict points, and it is the closest thing to slums that exist in Germany. Of course, they are not like the favelas of other countries, but they have some similarities. The Brennpunkte are usually very large and old apartment blocks, mostly built after the war era. At the time, the idea was for the government to offer affordable housing, to accommodate a rapidly growing population and the industrial workers of the era. However, over time, these areas began to concentrate people in more vulnerable situations: newly arrived immigrants, low-income families, the unemployed. Thus, these neighborhoods, which were originally thought of as a solution, ended up becoming a kind of social exclusion zone. Many of the buildings are in precarious conditions because they don't receive proper maintenance. For migrants, for example, these neighborhoods are often a starting point. Many people arrive in Germany without speaking the language, without contacts, and end up living here because the rent is cheaper. It's a rather sad reality, which also faces a lot of prejudice from a large part of the population. Why is it that, despite being so wealthy, Germany has so many people living in hardship? This may seem contradictory, but there are several reasons behind this reality. The first is the rising cost of living, especially in large cities. Speaking of rents, for example, in cities like Berlin or Munich, apartment prices have risen so much in recent years that they have become a real nightmare for those with middle or low incomes. To give you an idea, the rent for a simple two-bedroom apartment in Munich can easily exceed 1,500 euros per month. And that's not counting additional costs like energy, water, heating, and internet. Just these basic bills already represent a huge burden. Moreover, the cost of energy is through the roof. Bills for heating have increased significantly in recent years, especially due to crises in gas and energy supply. This increase particularly affects low-income families who have no room to cut other expenses and still cover the bills. Even food has become more expensive, with food inflation reaching record levels in the country. All of this is linked to a much bigger problem: the housing crisis. There simply aren't affordable houses or apartments for everyone. In 2024, it's estimated that millions of people in Germany are struggling to find housing they can afford. And those who manage to find a place to live often spend a significant portion of their salary just on rent. Now, there's also a group that suffers even more from all this: the so-called working poor. These are people who are employed, work a lot, but still can't cover the basics. This is really absurd, but it happens because even with a relatively high salary compared to other countries, it's not enough to keep up with the cost of living. And there's another detail: many of these workers are in part-time jobs. Migrants, for example, end up taking low-paid jobs because they have fewer options in the market. Single mothers, as I mentioned before, have to balance work and childcare at the same time and often can only get part-time jobs, which further limits their income. So, at the end of the day, Germany is a very wealthy country, but that wealth is not well distributed. While some people live very well in extremely exclusive neighborhoods, others barely manage to survive without any kind of help. It's a huge contrast that exists in the country, but is rarely seen in the headlines and media. This is a topic that has also made me think a lot about our situation and that of other countries going through a similar situation. But comment below what you think, and if you want to know more about a big problem that is happening now in Portugal, click on the video that is appearing on the final screen.